A warm afternoon in New York. One of those rare January days where the sun was gentle enough to push back the lingering winter chill. Outside a high-end cafe on Fifth Avenue, a young man sat quietly at an outdoor table. His sunglasses masked the sharpness of his features, but there was no mistaking him. Barron Trump. Even in his early 20s, he carried an air of composed detachment, distant but never arrogant. Pedestrians stole glances his way, some whispering amongst themselves, but no one dared to interrupt his solitude. Across the street, another man stood, nearly invisible to the rushing crowd. His clothes were mismatched and layered, each frayed edge and stubborn stain a chapter in a story no one wanted to read. His hair was unkempt, dark circles hung heavy under his eyes, souvenirs of sleepless nights spent in the open. One hand clutched a small cardboard sign, the other dipped in and out of his pocket. A nervous habit, or maybe a desperate grasp at something familiar. His name was Ethan Miller, and today marked his third week sleeping behind a convenience store dumpster. He hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days. Hunger gnawed at him, a relentless, cruel reminder of how far he had fallen. Scanning the cafe for a face that might offer kindness, his gaze landed on Barron Trump. For a moment he hesitated. What reason would someone like that have to care about someone like him? But hunger had a way of eroding pride. Taking a breath, Ethan crossed the street. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his failures dragged behind him. When he reached Barron's table, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, could you spare $1? Barron slowly looked up, sliding his sunglasses off. His expression was unreadable, neither cold nor sympathetic. For a brief moment, Ethan wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. But then, Barron leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan as if piecing together a puzzle. The seconds stretched long, and Ethan felt his anxiety tighten like a noose. He was about to apologize and slip away when Barron finally spoke. $1, huh?" His voice was calm, steady. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Sit down, let's talk." Ethan froze. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Sit down? With Barron Trump? He searched the young billionaire's face for any trace of mockery, any sign that this was some cruel joke. But there was nothing. Just curiosity, no pity, no judgment. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Thank you." He eased into the seat across from Barron, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the cardboard sign on the table, angling it away from view. He could feel Barron watching him. Not with disdain, not with discomfort, but as if he actually wanted to hear what Ethan had to say. That was new. Most people avoided eye contact. Some tossed a few coins his way without a second thought. But Barron Trump was looking right at him, and before Ethan could stop himself, the words started pouring out like a dam breaking. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you," Ethan stammered, his voice dry. "I don't usually... I hate asking for help." He dropped his gaze, shame rising in his throat like bile. But Barron said nothing. He just listened. For the first time in years, someone was actually listening. Ethan inhaled sharply, trying to steady his voice. "I used to be a contractor," he admitted. "Had a crew, steady work, good life." Then the recession hit, and everything vanished. Savings dried up faster than I ever thought possible. Then came the overdue notices, and after that, he trailed off, swallowing hard. Then a bitter chuckle escaped him. "Funny, isn't it?" He shook his head. "I spent my whole life building homes for other people, and now I don't even have a roof over my own head." Barron still didn't speak, but there was something in his expression. Something softer. Ethan shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling exposed. "I know people ask you for things all the time," he muttered. "I don't want to be one of those people. His voice cracked. "I don't know what else to do anymore." But Barron Trump wasn't the kind of man to dismiss a story like that. and his response was something Ethan never saw coming. Barron leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The air between them grew heavier, as if the world itself had slowed for this moment. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had braced himself for the usual response, a few bucks and a polite nod before being sent on his way. But instead, Barron asked him a question he wasn't ready for. "What's your name?" Ethan blinked. That wasn't what he expected. "Ethan." Barry nodded slowly, as if letting the name settle. "Ethan," he repeated, his tone steady. Then, after a brief pause, he said something Ethan would never forget. "I've met all kinds of people in my life." Barron leaned back. Ingénieurs, soldiers, politicians, homeless men. And if there's one thing I've learnt, it's that everyone has a story. Some good, some painful, some downright brutal. But the important thing isn't the past. Barron leaned in, his gaze locking onto Ethan's. It's what the next chapter looks like. Ethan stared at him, unsure if Barron was being serious. "The next chapter?" he echoed, disbelief laced in his voice. Barron smirked slightly, taking a sip of his lemonade. "You're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So, what's the next chapter of your story?" Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He had no answer. The truth was, he hadn't dared to think beyond the present moment in a long time. When survival is your only focus, there's no room for long-term plans. "I don't know," Ethan finally admitted. "I'm just trying to make it through the day." Barron narrowed his eyes slightly. Not in anger, but in thought. "That's not a chapter, Ethan, that's just a sentence. You need a real chapter, something you can build on." Ethan felt a strange mix of frustration and curiosity. He wanted to push back, to ask what the hell Barron Trump knew about struggle. But he kept his mouth shut. There was something in Barron's tone, not empty platitudes, but a challenge. A genuine push to make Ethan think. Then Barron reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet. Ethan's heart sank. This was it. The part where Barron would take out a bill, hand it over, and send him on his way. Just like everyone else. But no, Barron didn't pull out cash. Instead, he took out a business card, placing it gently on the table. "Go here." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "It's a support centre run by someone I know. They'll help you get cleaned up, find work, maybe even a place to stay. But the choice is yours. No one can take the first step for you." Ethan stared at the card, his hands trembling slightly. "Why?" His voice was hoarse, on the verge of breaking. "Why are you doing this for me?" Barron's gaze softened just a fraction. His voice was calm, but weighted. "Because we should give others a chance when we can." But Ethan wasn't sure if he could believe in second chances anymore. Not after everything. His fingers hovered over the card as if it were made of glass. Fragile, full of promise, but impossibly delicate. Did he deserve this? The name and address printed on it felt like a lifeline, but his doubt was heavier than the hope it carried. Could he really trust this? Could he trust Barron Trump? "I don't know," Ethan muttered, shaking his head, his voice barely audible over the hum of the street. "I've tried places like that before. They don't really help people like me." Barron didn't flinch. "People like you?" he asked, his voice free of judgment but full of intent. Ethan swallowed hard, avoiding his gaze. "You wouldn't understand. Guys like me, we're just the forgotten ones." Barron leaned forward slowly, his voice dropping lower, more powerful. "It's not about how many times you fall. It's about whether you get back up, even when everything is working against you." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue, to push back, but there was nothing to say. Barron leaned back in his chair, his voice softer now. "But there's one thing I do know for sure. Life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide whether you'll let that break you or let it shape you. Ethan felt a sting in his eyes, but he blinked it away. He wouldn't let himself cry. It's not that simple, he rasped. No, it's not, Barron agreed. But simple doesn't mean easy. He met Ethan's gaze, unwavering. But if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been. Ethan looked down at the business card again, his mind spinning. He thought about the nights spent on freezing concrete, the meals scavenged from dumpsters, the faces that turned away when he needed help. And now, a complete stranger, someone he never imagined would even notice him, was telling him he was worth more than all of that. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe. Or maybe just the realization that he had nothing left to lose. I'll think about it, Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. Good, I hope you do. Ethan clutched the business card as he stood up, unsure of what to say or how to feel. He took a few steps, then hesitated. Turning back, he met Barron's eyes. Thanks for listening, he said quietly, his voice raw. Barron gave a slight nod, his face unreadable. Take care of yourself, Ethan. For Barron, helping Ethan wasn't charity. It was about giving someone a chance. He knew the road ahead for Ethan wouldn't be easy. But sometimes, all a person needs is someone to believe in them. Meanwhile, Ethan wandered aimlessly through the city streets, clutching the business card tightly in his hand. He passed shop windows where his reflection stared back at him. Exhausted, worn down, defeated. But, for the first time in a long while, a flicker of something stirred inside him. Ethan stopped in front of a laundromat, his eyes fixed on the flickering neon sign. With the few dollars he had left, he made a decision. He would wash his clothes. If he was going to show up at the place Barron had mentioned, he wanted to look presentable. It wasn't much, but it was a step, and the first step is always the hardest. But also the most important one Ethan had taken in years. Walking into the support center for the first time, Ethan felt overwhelmed. Bright fluorescent lights, the hurried sound of footsteps, the steady murmur of conversations. It made him feel out of place, like he didn't belong there. But the staff was kind. They didn't judge him. They didn't see him as a problem. They saw him as a person. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen. Days turned into weeks, and though the path was far from smooth, Ethan slowly began rebuilding his life. The center helped him land a temporary job at a local warehouse, where he quickly proved himself to be hardworking and reliable. With the money he earned, he moved into a small shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head, a step towards stability. And through it all, he couldn't stop thinking about Barron Trump. One night, after an exhausting shift, Ethan sat down and wrote Barron a letter. He thanked him for the kindness he had shown that day at the cafe. He told him about the progress he had made. Ethan didn't expect a response, but writing the letter felt like closure. A way to acknowledge the man who had given him a second chance. A few weeks later, Barron received the letter. Sitting alone in his quiet office, he read every word carefully. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He folded the letter neatly and placed it inside a drawer where he kept the important keepsakes of his life. Because for Barron, it was never about recognition or gratitude. It was about continuing the cycle of compassion and giving. But Ethan's story didn't end there. Inspired by his own journey, he started volunteering at the same support center, the place that had helped him rise again. He spoke with others who were struggling, shared his story, and gave them the same encouragement that Barron had given him. Bit by bit, Ethan became a symbol of resilience and hope in his community. And that cafe on Fifth Avenue? It remained just a quiet corner in a bustling city, a place where thousands walked by every day, unaware that a single conversation there had changed a life. But for Ethan and Barron, it was never just a meeting. It was proof that the connection between people has power, that a simple act of kindness can create ripples far beyond what we can imagine. And for anyone who hears this story, remember this: sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead to the biggest changes. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends, helping us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.